So let's take a look at number 1. What's the first thing we should do? Do what? Subtract 9, yes. We want to move everything to one side. So we have x squared minus 9 is greater than or equal to 0. How do I factor? It's the difference of two squares. So it factors into x plus 3 and x minus 3. It's greater than or equal to 0. So I'm going to set both pieces greater than or equal to 0. So x plus 3 is greater than or equal to 0, and x minus 3 is greater than or equal to 0. So x is greater than or equal to negative 3, and x is greater than or equal to positive 3. Now let's plug them in on a number line to see if we're talking about in between or outside of these two values. So I have negative 3 and positive 3. Am I going to have an open circle or closed circle at these points? Closed circle, because it's greater than or equal to. That equal to means we have a closed circle. Now what number do you want to plug in here to check? Let's plug in 0. 0 is a nice number in between. We can see if it works in between. So I'm going to plug it into my original inequality here. So 0 squared is less than or equal to 9. Or greater than or equal to 9. Is 0 greater than or equal to 9? No. So we're not going to color on the inside. Let's just check the outsides to be sure. What's a number outside of my two key points that I could pick? Let's do negative 4. So we have negative 4 squared is greater than or equal to 9. So 16 is greater than or equal to 9. Is this true? Yep. So we're going to color on the outside. If you want to be super, super sure, you could plug in positive 4 and check that one too, but that's going to work also. So we're talking about the outsides. So now let's write our interval notation. So our left arrow is pointing to the left. So what's our smallest value that we're talking about here? Negative infinity. Is negative infinity going to get a parentheses or bracket? Parentheses. And then this goes all the way up to what? Negative 3. Is negative 3 going to get a parentheses or bracket? Bracket, because it's a closed circle. Then we put a U to connect our two. So then we start up again at what point? Bracket 3. And it points to the right forever, so it goes to infinity with a parentheses. These would be the two things that you put into WebAssign. It's asking for the number line and also the interval notation, but let's write our inequality too. So we're talking about numbers that are less than negative 3, so we'd say x is less than or equal to negative 3. We're also talking about values that are greater than positive 3. So x is greater than or equal to positive 3.
When you're writing inequalities, you just follow the arrows where they're pointing, right?
Yeah. So if you list x first, so like for our first inequality, this one,
Yeah.
we're talking about the left side here. Right.
Okay.
So it's pointing to the left. So our little arrow here is going to also point to the left.
Okay.
When you have two parts of your number line, you're going to have two inequalities. You have to list them separately. So looking at number 2, all of our terms are already on one side. So what do I do next? Factor out the GCF. What's our GCF here? X. We're going to take out an X. So X on the outside, and we're left with X minus 2 is less than or equal to 0. Now that it's factored, we're going to set each piece less than or equal to 0. So X is less than or equal to 0, and X minus 2 is less than or equal to 0. So X is less than to 0 is one part, and then x is less than or equal to positive 2 would be the other. Let's put our key points on the number line. So we have 0 and 2. What's a number outside of 0 and 2 that you want to try?
-1.
We can plug in -1, that works. 3 would also work. That's a good number to try too. So let's plug in -1 squared minus 2 times -1 is less than or equal to 0. So we got 1 plus 2 is less than or equal to 0. So is 3 less than or equal to 0? No. So outside is probably not going to work. Let's check inside. What's a number in between 0 and 2? 1. So let's plug in 1. We have 1 squared minus 2 times 1 is less than or equal to 0. So 1 minus 2 is less than or equal to 0. Is -1 less than or equal to 0?
Yeah.
Yes, so that works. So in between works. At 0, am I going to have an open circle or closed circle? Closed circle because it's less than or equal to. At 2, open circle or closed circle? Closed circle, again, because it's less than or equal to. So how would we write our interval notation here? We're talking about numbers in between 0 and 2. So what's the first number going to be in my interval? 0. It's my smallest value that the line touches here, 0. Do I get a bracket or parentheses at 0? Bracket, because it's a closed circle. What's the largest number that is on my number line here? 2. And a bracket. And then my inequality, we're talking about values in between 0 and 2, so I'm going to say 0 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to 2. So these are the 3 parts to my answer. I'm pretty sure on WebAssign it only asks for the number line and your interval notation.
For the inequalities, it's like when your line is in between your key terms.
So notice the difference between 1 and 2 that we just did. In number 1, we colored outside. So we had 2 little parts to our interval notation, 2 parts, because we colored outside of the 2 key values. And we had 2 parts to our inequality. In number 2, we colored in between, so we have 1 part to our interval notation and 1 inequality. So it's just important to know the difference between those 2. So let's take a look at number 4. What should we do first for number 4? Move everything to the other side. So I like it when my leading coefficient's positive, so I'm going to move everything to the left side. So I'm going to subtract x and subtract 2. So x squared minus x minus 2 is less than 0. Now let's factor. What are 2 factors of -2 that add to -1? -2 and 1. So this factors into x minus 2, and x plus 1 is less than 0. What do I do next? What do I do next? Set each piece equal to 0. So we have x minus 2 equals 0 and x plus 1 equals 0. So x is equal to 2 and x is equal to -1. So I'm going to put those 2 key values on my number line. Start with the smallest ones. We have -1 and 2. At these points, do I put open circles or closed circles? If it's just a less than sign, what do we put? Open circles. Now we need to figure out if we're going to shade in between these 2 points or outside. So let's plug in a number outside. What's a number smaller than -1? -2. So let's plug it into our inequality up here. We have negative 2 squared is less than negative 2 plus 2. So 4 is less than 0. Is that true? No. So outside doesn't work. So that means in between's probably going to work, but let's just check it to be super sure. What's the number in between negative 1 and 2? 0. So let's plug in 0. 0 squared is less than 0 plus 2. Is 0 less than 2? Yes. So in between works. So our interval is going to go from negative 1 to 2. So does it get a bracket or parentheses at negative 1? Parentheses, because it's an open circle. So negative 1, and our graph ends at 2, which also gets a parentheses. So this would be our interval notation. You only have one part of the graph. When you highlight in between, you just have one interval. But notice how in the last one we did, we highlighted the outside, so we had 2 parts of our graph, so we had 2 intervals. Now, x is in between. X can be any value in between negative 1 and 2. So I'm going to say negative 1 is less than x, which is less than 2. So if you highlight in between and you only have one interval, you only need one inequality. But again, notice in the last one when we highlighted outside, we had to have 2 inequalities. So this is the 3 parts to our answer.